Welcome here, everybody, coming from all over the country to History and Politics Chat. I think I just called it Politics Chat this morning, today when I did it, just wrote up the title on Facebook. I keep forgetting I have to title these now before I'm allowed on. A quick reminder, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. So I have a bunch of questions that you have asked here, and I will do the best I can with them. If there are things that you would, I'm sorry, I'm looking at a second screen over here because I wanted to keep the comments open today in case there are things that I'm not covering as quickly as you would like me to cover them. I cannot promise to get to everything, but I did try and keep a running list here of questions that people asked about where we are. So I'm going to start first of all with the simple questions. Somebody asked, can the president and the vice president be sworn in before the official ceremony? And if yes, what is the earliest this could happen? No, they can't. Because remember, what is really at stake here is not their swearing in, it's the end of the previous term. So I suppose technically they could be sworn in a few minutes early, but it doesn't take until the previous president's term ends, which is at noon on January 20th of 2021. And that's just the way it is. And so when people talked about him extending his term, if you remember, people were frightened about that and all those things that happened. Historians like me were always saying, it can't happen because his term's going to be over. So at that point, all the power drops away, which is kind of a cool feature of our system, to be honest. But here we are down at the end of that term coming up, and all this will take place tomorrow. Okay, people have asked why it isn't being done in secret. And the answer to that is, think about what that says. That says that there's something wrong about it. If you're doing it in secret, something's wrong about it. And I know people talk about security issues. I have to say, I agree with the people who suggest that it should be in public, simply for the fact that Abraham Lincoln at first sort of snuck into Washington, D.C., and for a long time, his presidency was tarnished with the idea that he was a burglar sneaking into D.C. And I think, especially under these circumstances, President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris need to be seen, and they need to say, hey, this is my territory, not their territory. That being said, I'm certain that the security around them is going to be extraordinary, as it already is. And a big shout out here to our military personnel who are, putting once again their lives between our elected representatives and people who would do the harm. And it's always important to remember that Biden, for example, and Harris are, yes, vice president-elect and president-elect. I got those reversed, but they're working for us. So if somebody attacks them, they are attacking us, and that matters a lot. And our military is right now standing there for us to make sure that that doesn't happen. All right, so that's why they're doing it in public, I'm certain, although it's going to be very small, of course. All right, so a couple more questions here about Trump in his last days. A lot of questions about pardons, and I urge you, when you have legal questions, to go to Twitter, even if you're not on Twitter, and read Steve Vladek, Vledeck, because he's got really, really wonderful threads on things like pardons. So here's what he says about pardons. I shouldn't don't blame him entirely for what I'm going to say, because he's a law professor, I'm a history professor, so our takes are a little bit different on some of the history of the pardoning power. But the president does have the absolute power to pardon. It's like a get out of jail free card, even if it's a terrible pardon, even if it's a corrupt pardon, even if it sucks, even if it's a country, even if you fill in the blank, the president's pardon is a get out of jail free card. And that's really what screwed up Reconstruction, is that in the summer of 1865, Andrew Johnson went ahead and pardoned all but about 1,500 of the leading former Confederates who had created the rebellion. And he pardoned them. And once he pardoned them, that was it. They were back in the body politic, and they ran for office, and they were, the vice president of the Confederacy was reelected as a senator from Georgia. I mean, that's insane, but he could do it because he was the president. So there's some questions about the pardoning power. So one of them is, can he pardon people even though he is currently himself impeached? Now, there's a big fight about that, and I would love to say to you, oh no, he can't, because of the language in the Constitution, which says that he has the power to pardon, except in cases of impeachment. I'm afraid, at least as I read that, and as I think most constitutional scholars read that, that means the president cannot step in to overturn somebody else's impeachment. They were not at the time expecting that the president would be under impeachment, because the whole point of the impeachment process, as it is set up in the Constitution, is to be able to remove a president. And so if a president is behaving badly and you don't trust him with the impeachment power, the Senate and the House of Representatives is supposed to impeach him, and the Senate is supposed to convict. Because remember, when they created the Constitution, the founders did not expect there to be political parties. That's a really big deal, the fact they did not expect there to be political parties. By the way, if you find this stuff really interesting, I'm playing with a new book, and I'm wondering what to put in it. And like the whole idea of political parties and all that is really interesting to me. And that's why I advocate for both parties, because it's part of our democratic system. But I'm not sure if that's interesting to anybody but me. So if it is, let me know, because I won't put it in the book otherwise. So they didn't foresee there being this political split. And realistically, and I am really speaking as a historian here, Donald Trump never should have been able to walk away from that first impeachment. What had happened with Ukraine was outrageous, and the fact that the Senate was so wedded to its party that it wouldn't convict him. It was a huge stain against them. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But it also really short-circuited their system, because it left power in the hands of a corrupt person. And that's not the way it's supposed to work. So now we're looking at the issue not of impeachment, although I will talk more about that in just a second, because obviously we're in a second impeachment. But it also speaks to the issue of pardons. He shouldn't be in office to be pardoning people. So do I think it means that he can't pardon people even though he's been impeached? I'm sorry, no. I think that probably can happen. So the reason for that is, of course, that you want there to be kind of a get out of jail free card in case the courts screw up, which is how it was intended originally. All right. So can the president do a blanket pardon? Absolutely. Jimmy Carter did so when he issued a blanket pardon to draft dodgers, if you are old enough to remember that. There's a little bit of an issue to that, though, although legal scholars argue about this, and that is that you can't say, I give you a pardon for everything you've done from May through the following December. You have to actually sort of specify what you are pardoning somebody for, because you can't give anybody just a blanket, I don't care what you did, you're free, because it turns out they're a serial killer. That's probably not a good thing for the country. So, and scholars do argue about that. Some say it is possible to go ahead and pardon somebody for everything over a certain period of time. But many legal scholars think you have to be a bit more specific about what you're pardoning somebody for. So they're blanket pardons, but there are some exceptions. So for example, well, I won't go into examples there because never mind. So yes, you can have a blanket pardon, and the other question people ask about is a self-pardon, and that is possible. It's never been tried. Most people think it would probably not stand up in court, because the whole point was not to pardon yourself. I mean, that's sort of antithetical to the whole idea of how the system works, for a president to be able to commit crimes and then pardon himself. There's also an argument about whether or not you can pardon somebody for crimes in which you are implicated. And that would be a huge problem, obviously, because a president could have a whole cadre of people who break all kinds of laws, and then he could pardon them at the last second and everybody would walk home free. That's, again, something that legal scholars wonder about. But right now, it certainly looks like the pardons that we're seeing are going to stand. Next question that people are talking about is secret pardons? Could he have secretly pardoned people and we won't find out about it until later? And I'm going to defer to Dr. Vladeck here. He says, yeah, maybe, but like the power goes with the office, not with the person. So what's the point of that? Because the next president would go ahead and simply tell you who was in the pardons. So that doesn't really, that sounds like it sounds a little bit odd, maybe. But that's something I guess that I'm just going to defer to Vladeck on that. All right, so the other question is, oh, I'm sorry, that's impeachment, not pardoning power. All right, let me go back over here so I can see if you're asking questions. There's a question about what I just saw here, a question about whether or not somebody can buy a pardon. And is that okay? Well, no, technically it's not okay. That's bribery. And as I understand it, I am not a lawyer, but as I understand it, you could buy a pardon for the crime you committed, but then you have committed another crime for which you have not been pardoned by buying the pardons. So there's a lot of vagueness around that. It's the limits of the presidential pardons have never been tested. Somebody asked me if there have been corrupt pardons in the past. Yes, of course there have. Again, Andrew Johnson springs to mind, but there are plenty of others. And it's also worth remembering that by nature of our political system, anybody who pardons, any president who pardons somebody, the opposing party is going to say those are corrupt pardons. So Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon springs to mind. He was pardoned for crimes for which he had not been indicted. In fact, the House as a whole had not passed articles of impeachment yet, although it was going to. It had just gone through the House Judiciary Committee, and he just pardoned him for any of those crimes. And a lot of people thought that was a corrupt bargain, that he got the vice presidency in order to do that and to try and save the Republican Party. The jury's out on that. Ford was a deeply principled man in many ways, and in most ways, and maybe he really thought that. I'm going to take a pass on that one, and I think you could make an argument either way. So yeah, people are always upset about pardons. State pardons are a different kettle of fish, and sometimes those really are blatantly corrupt. And it's worth remembering that presidential pardons are only for federal crimes or things that are local in DC over which he has jurisdiction, or some of the other things that are bring the federal government into sway, and that reflect on the federal government. And that is, of course, why they put in that why the House of Representatives put into its article of impeachment against Trump that phone call to Georgia, so that even if the Georgians walked away from that crime against the state of Georgia, it would still be something that they could go after Donald Trump for, which is kind of interesting if you think about it. If you have not read the article of impeachment, which I linked in at least one of my letters, I urge you to do it. It's very short. I think it's about 4 pages, and it's just cool. I mean, this is like, there's never been a president impeached twice before, so why wouldn't you want to go ahead and take a look at it? It's very clear. It's printed in big letters, and you can just Google. I'm sure you can just Google Trump second impeachment, text, and it'll come up. And it's cool to see how the bills actually look. When you look at that is actually what a law looks like when you're reading it. Weirdly, they still look very 19th century, which is cool. Somebody just asked, doesn't somebody have to be convicted before they can be pardoned? No. Richard Nixon was not convicted of anything. He was not even charged with anything. And he got a pardon for that as well. And similarly, the draft dodgers under Jimmy Carter hadn't been charged or convicted with anything. All right, so now some more questions, just throwing this in here. That's pardons. Oh, people have asked more about the meaning of impeachment, and I will talk a little bit more about impeachment in a second, but and I want to develop that idea a little bit, but people have asked about the third Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which says that you can't hold office if you have been engaged in insurrection or sedition against the United States of America. And that, of course, was inserted in part to try and overcome the fact that that Andrew Johnson was madly pardoning people right and left. If you remember that, he was pardoning people, plus he had a blanket pardon of everybody after the proclamation of May 26 of 1865, in which he said, as long as you take an oath saying oopsie poopsie, and that's not literally what it was. It was, as long as you take an oath saying that you're going to support the Union from now on, the United States from now on, you're good, unless you were a high-ranking member of the military or of the political situation in the Confederacy, or if you'd taken an oath to the Union, or if you were worth more than $20,000. And when the Republican Congress throws out Johnson's plan, it's got to come up with a plan of its own. And they, as I say, they make this committee of 15, it's called, or the Joint Committee on Reconstruction. And they take testimony for a number of months from people in the South trying to figure out what things are really like down there. And then they got to come up with their own way to reconstruct the Union. And what they come up with is the 14th Amendment. That's what the 14th Amendment was designed to do. That's why it happened, and that's what it was designed to do. The 13th ends legal chattel slavery except in cases of crime for which you have been duly convicted. And that's a loophole that I keep saying I'll talk about in my Reconstruction videos, a big loophole. But then they've done that, but then they got to figure out how to get the country going again, and that's why we have the 14th. And the 14th is designed to say, okay, here are the rules under which we can live. African Americans are going to be citizens. We're going to go ahead and make sure that we're trying to push southern states toward letting them vote, and we're going to go ahead and make sure that if you participated in the Confederacy, you can't hold office again, because that's just stupid. And that's going to be overturned, by the way, in the late 19th century by a law. And so by 1879, we actually have a lot of former Confederate generals sitting in the Senate, especially, but also in the House of Representatives. And that's actually, come to think, I think they're more in the House. They have about 21 chairmanships of committees. They're a really powerful voice, and they actually tried to go ahead and shut down the government once and for all in 1879. Most people forget that story. It's an amazing story. That's why that's why we had James Garfield, is because the Democrats at that point have the House and the Senate, and Rutherford B. Hayes is the president. He's a Republican, and he's trying desperately to go ahead and protect African Americans in the South. And they try and shut down the United States government altogether in 1879 by not making any appropriations for it until Hayes agrees to take all the troops out of the South. The idea that the troops leave the South in 1877 is a complete myth. It is a complete myth. All that happens in 1879 is that the troops that are stationed around the South Carolina State House go back to their barracks, which are right now what is the reflecting pool at the University of South Carolina Library in Columbia. So they literally just march down the hill. That's all that happens in 1877. 1879, they try and go ahead and starve the government until it takes all the troops out of the South. And Rutherford B. Hayes says, we can't do this. That we're going to be letting these guys dictate. We're going to essentially let if we do that, we'll let the legislative branch dictate to the executive branch, and the executive branch has a role to play here too. And the person who manages to make this a federal deal, a national deal in newspapers all the time, and who manages to hold off the former Confederates is James Garfield, who's both a Lincoln Republican and cares a lot about black rights, but he's also really, really smart. He's a college professor. A professor of rhetoric, actually, as I recall, speaks a number of languages, really, really smart man. And that's why he is popular enough in 1880 to run for office. He's kind of a nothing before, sorry for all of you Garfield lovers out there. He is a member of the House of Representatives from Ohio. He had been a general in the Civil War, but he didn't, nobody thought he was presidential material. And then all of a sudden he actually shows up to nominate somebody else from Ohio, John Sherman, who is William Tecumseh Sherman's brother, for president in 1880. And everyone's like, nah, we'd rather have you. And so he becomes the presidential candidate. Anyway, so that's why we have the 14th Amendment. But as I say, they go ahead by law and pass a law that says, oh, well, never mind. It's okay if, I don't know, you killed 600,000 people. Kidding. They go ahead and they say it's okay if you serve in Congress again. And they do, and promptly they try and shut down the government. But a law is not a constitutional amendment. So that law does not trump this constitutional amendment. So people are looking at that constitutional amendment and saying, is this going to be enough to keep Donald Trump out of office again if he does not get convicted by the Senate? And the answer to that is quite likely, possibly. I don't think it's going to come to that, but it's a pretty wide open door there. A bigger issue is, because I'm going to tell you more about impeachment in just a second, is the senators and representatives who voted not to count the certified electoral votes for Joe Biden. And what will happen to them. And I would very much like to see the 14th Amendment enforced against them. What they did is not just paperwork. That's a really important thing. You know, I've seen a lot of people, especially on the right, being like, you know, what, it wasn't a big deal. You know, they had the votes, whatever. Literally, our system is set up in such a way that the states go ahead and decide for whom they have voted. And it goes through a lot of layers. And those votes were certified, they were counted, they were inspected, they were signed off on, and all that Congress had to do was to permit them to be counted. And for 150 Republicans to say, no, this isn't right. Now, it's fine to have one or two people sort of doing a protest vote. That's kind of, it's not a bad part of our system to be able to be the one person who stands up and says, no, I disagree with this because I care about, I don't know, the pumpkin harvest in New Jersey or whatever. It's kind of a good way to be able to go ahead and make a statement. But this was not making a statement about some smaller issue or some, you know, something to draw attention to something. This was an attempt to overturn the legitimate vote of the American people. And that's not a small deal. That's as big a deal as it comes, with the exception of including violence, which happened on later on that day, possibly abetted at least, if not aided, by members of the House of Representatives and possibly senators. That's not okay. So I would like to see that happen. Will the Senate be willing to do that to its own? Possibly. Will the House? Big stretch there. In either case, you need a majority vote, though, not a 2/3 vote, as I recall. I should look at that again, but I believe it's a majority vote. Don't quote me on that one, but I think that's right. All right, so hey, somebody's making fun of me talking about all you Garfield lovers out there. You know you're out there, and all of us will have dinner right around this desk, which is like this big. All right. So all right, let me then go to impeachment. We are in the midst of an impeachment. President Trump has been impeached in the largest bipartisan vote in American history. Like I say, when they invented the concept of impeachment, they did not expect there to be political parties. So since the beginning, when we have had presidential impeachments, they have tended to be by political party. Now, a little bit of a caveat there, because when Andrew Johnson was impeached after the Civil War, there was a supermajority in Congress. So to say it wasn't as bipartisan today, after the 1866 elections, the Republican Party had a supermajority in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, as I recall, which means that there just weren't that many Democrats. So there were tons of Republicans who voted that way. And as you know, a lot of Republicans actually jumped ship and voted on the other side to acquit him in the Senate. But so you get a little bit of a caveat there. But 10 Republicans in the House of Representatives, including Liz Cheney, and that was a big deal. She's from Wyoming, and she is the third most powerful Republican in the House, jumped ship and said, yeah, we think he launched an insurrection against the U.S. government. And that stands. So now, as of today, and I haven't looked at the news today, believe it or not. I actually have school's about to start, so I'm trying to get my courses up and running. So I don't know what happened today. Maybe somebody does. But the Senate needs to take up the articles of impeachment. And the real question that people are looking at is the Senate going to convict? And of course, nobody knows what's going to happen in the future, right? But really interesting things have been happening on that front. Interesting in part because of Donald Trump, but also in part because of what they say about the Senate and the future of the Republican Party. So the thing to which I'm referring is something that Mitch McConnell said today. Mitch McConnell gave up and gave a speech, got up and gave a speech in which he put the blame for the insurrection of January 6th firmly at the footsteps of Donald Trump. And he said something like, people were misled by the president and by other powerful people. Well, like him, right? And like some of the other senators, of course, and representatives and members of the Republican Party. But he doesn't do that. He called out Trump by name. And to me, that was a big signal, because what that said, McConnell's easy in a way. So you're always sort of, people tear their hair out over McConnell because of everything he has done or not done. McConnell is in this for power and money, but power above money. So you can always read the room by looking at McConnell. What is he doing? And whatever he says, it's never about anything but power. So you watch him and you say, what's he doing and what's in it for him? So he went ahead today and said he blamed everything on Trump. So what does that say? That says, first of all, he has made the calculation that in the growing split between let's call them establishment Republicans, but they're really not. I'll explain why in a minute, but I'm going to call them that. The McConnell Republicans, the Liz Cheney Republicans, and the Donald Trump Republicans. There's been a widening split in which the establishment Republicans have been trying to keep their mouths shut and put up with Trump's extremes because they want those voters. They want those Republican voters. But now, in part because Trump pushed so hard, especially in Georgia, where he essentially worked to tank the two Republican senators in Georgia because he was trying to force Georgia to go ahead and switch its electoral votes to him, totally illegally, by the way. That because Trump forced that, Trump's voters are now like, it's us or the highway. And McConnell clearly has made the decision to toss the Trump people overboard. Now, why did he do that? He did that because of corporate pressure. The fact that I'm assuming, mind you, you should understand here, I have not seen any documents because they don't exist yet. They will. Historians in 2 generations will see these documents. This is my read of the situation based on my understanding of power politics in Washington, D.C. I could be wrong. Mitch McConnell could have gone to church this morning with Joe Biden, as I understand he did, and had a revelation and changed completely who he is, in which case I'm entirely wrong. But my read from what I know of McConnell and what I know about power politics is that McConnell's real power does not come from Kentucky. McConnell's real power comes from the fact that he's the broker who gets to hand out the money for the races, the Republican races around the country. And the more money he has, the more power he has. And when corporate America announced the other day that it was not going to be giving any more money to Republican candidates who had not backed the election, the counting of the votes, and when they said, at least briefly, they were going to stop political giving altogether, McConnell saw the writing on the wall that he had to go ahead and answer to his corporate donors. And the corporate donors were pretty clear: dump the Trumpers, dump the people who took on tried to destroy the Capitol, or don't expect to see any more money from us. Now, would they have held to that? Who knows? But McConnell is clearly trying to do just enough to get that money back. So what's interesting about that is that if you listen to the speech, okay, maybe I looked at a little news today, but mostly I worked in my course. If you listen to the rest of the speech, a lot of people made a big deal about him blaming Trump, which is a big deal because, like I say, it indicates this big split in the Republican Party. But what he went on to say is, now is not the time for any new initiatives, any major change in ideology. That was a deliberate undercutting of everything that Biden and Harris have promised to do, because Biden and Harris have promised to end this sort of Republican dominance of tax cuts and pro-corporate everything and all the money moving upward. And they have said that they are going to bring back some form of the New Deal. And McConnell came right out and said, nope, that is not happening. And he said, the thing that infuriated me about that is he said, the American people elected, by very close margins. The Democrats have the House and Senate, but by very small margins. Well, of course, the House is completely gerrymandered. So, it's like saying, you're playing a soccer game and, you give one team like 3 more players and take 2 players off the other side and then say, yeah, we won. So, it was a tie. So, we're equally good. It's like, that's not actually how it works. But it does work in terms of how power is assessed in the Senate. So McConnell is not here. He is dumping Trump because of the power politics of it and because of the money aspect of it, but not because he has any intention at all of changing the way he approaches governance. So that brings me back to impeachment. And that is the question of is Trump going to be convicted by the Senate? And if I had to take a bet right now, I would say yes. And I fortunately don't have to take a bet, but if I did have to take a bet, I would say yes. And here's why. Because what McConnell did today is he put firmly at Trump's feet the blame for what happened on January 6th. And if he can pin that just to Trump rather than the whole Republican Party, then he's cleansed the party of the taint of that insurrection, which is big. So he has said he's not going to whip his caucus to go ahead and vote for acquittal. And what that means when you whip the caucus, and you might have heard the term a majority whip or a minority whip, that's the person designated by the party in either the House or the Senate to go around to the members of that party called the caucus and say to them, we need your vote on the bill for whatever. And you might really not like it. And you're like, I'm not comfortable with that bill. My constituents don't want it, whatever. And you're like, well, what can we do to make it so you will vote for this bill? And maybe it's not necessarily that heavy-handed always, but what it amounts to is it manages to keep the caucus together and voting pretty much in lockstep. And ultimately, and this is one of the things that all of us said when people would complain about things Trump was doing, is that the Senate could have stopped this at any moment, and they could have stopped Trump at any moment by simply refusing to do his bidding. And one of the things that whips can do is they can take away committee assignments. So, you could be the best senator in the world from, the state of, I always pick on a different state here, the state of Indiana, and your constituents could love you. But if they strip you of all your committee assignments, you are completely useless. So you're not going to be in office very long. It's a really powerful position, really, the whip, and the what's it called? The conference chair, who helps to decide. That's what Liz Cheney is, who helps to decide who sits on what committees. All right. So he has said to go ahead and do whatever you want, which gives the option of people to vote in favor of conviction. It gives them the option to vote against conviction. It also gives them the option of staying home. And that's, it's a 2/3 vote of the people present, as I recall, which would give people an out. I couldn't, it was a pandemic. I couldn't go into the Senate. Bummer. Plus Trump at this point is gone. He'll be gone. So it's kind of there's not a lot of downsides to voting for conviction unless you're in a bright red district. But you know what? A lot of those people are in trouble anyway because of the Trump power in the Republican Party in those places now. I don't know. I do the calculation. I think it's probably better for McConnell and the party to convict him than not now. So that's my read on it. I don't know. But so if in fact he is convicted in the Senate, he will be the first president to be impeached twice and the first to be convicted. The president's never been convicted before. But that does not mean that he can't hold office. That will require another vote, but only a majority vote. That's an easy one to get, and he doesn't have to be convicted for that to happen. And that's an almost certain one, I would think, because Republicans don't want him to run again. They want that removed from him because he's not leaving any oxygen for anybody else, and he is clearly making the party all about himself, which is ultimately not good for their own fiefdoms. So my guess is it's going to be a real rocky road for Donald Trump for the next couple of weeks, not only because of that, but of course on the 21st, he is, or as of noon tomorrow, he is eligible for indictments. And many people, including me, expect that he will be seeing indictments coming up in the next few weeks. And because you can't indict a sitting president, he won't any longer be a sitting president. There is that, and here's the other piece about going forward with Trump, and why one of the reasons that I suspect McConnell wanted to wait until he was out of office to hold the impeachment trial. Some people are saying that you can't have a trial, but we've had impeachment trials when somebody was no longer in office before. There's no reason you can't. As far as I mean, lawyers are going to argue that one, but there's a precedent, and nobody argued about it then. And Jonathan Turley, who is now arguing against the idea, argued in favor of it. When it was a Democrat. So that's going to be a hard one. But the other thing that always astonishes me, and has astonished me since the Republicans acquiesced to the nomination of Trump, is that the stuff that's going to come out when he's out of office is bad. You just know it is. I mean, has anything good come out of the investigation into January 6th? I mean, has there been anything positive? Perhaps the police officer who appears to have switched very quick thinking into a MAGA hat to try and get people to safety. If that story is true, I didn't read that carefully, but otherwise, it's bad. And as a Republican Party, do you want to be chained to that? Nixon was bad enough. So anyway, my guess is, I'm gaming this out here, but my guess is that that's what's going on with what's going to happen with conviction. So now the other question here on this people wanted to know about is, somebody asked, does McConnell want to be rid of Trump? Absolutely. And not Trump so much. I mean, certainly Trump. Trump's a wild card for sure, but Trump is also 75, something like that, and not in terribly good health. So you don't really have to worry about Trump being around forever. But what you do need to worry about is him salting all of the committee chairmanships across the country with his own supporters, in which case we're just going to see a litany of Trump's running for office from now till eternity, and that becomes a monarchy or a dynasty that certainly somebody like McConnell or any institutionalist or any establishment Republican isn't going to want to have going. Somebody just said the director of the census refused to do Trump's bidding. Actually, that was the other way around. He was a Trumper, and he was trying to force other people into producing a report on undocumented immigrants. And there was a whistleblower who said, this is nuts, and the guy just resigned, who was trying to make that happen. People are asking, how do you get rid of senators and representatives? You get rid of them through voting or through expulsion. And the question I think that you're asking is, will the Senate expel Hawley and Cruz? And I think that depends on what more comes out about them. And remember, when you and I are looking at the news, what we are seeing is just the tip of the iceberg. We still have a really good intelligence series of intelligence organizations in the country, and they will know a heck of a lot more than you and I ever will. So if they are tightly implicated into the events of January 6th, that will come out, I suspect. All right, a couple more questions here on that. That was impeachment. Oh, power sharing. People are upset about the fact that Charles Schumer of New York, who was the Senate minority leader, is now the Senate majority leader, and he has worked out a power sharing arrangement with Mitch McConnell. And why? People are saying, the Democrats won. Why did they do this? Well, here's the problem. The Democrats won, but they won 50-50. And what that means, think about what that means. that means that the Republicans really could stop almost anything if they wanted to. They can slow stuff down, they can argue constantly, they can do any number of things. And in order to move the Senate along and to get things happening, they really kind of had to come up with an arrangement. And when there's a 50-50 split, there's often an arrangement. Now, mind you, McConnell's going to do anything he can to stop every single thing that the Democrats want. He's announced it, right? But today in that speech where he said this is not a time for any new intellectual experiments or something, whatever. He was basically saying, we're not changing course as far as I'm concerned. But the power sharing is the way they've set it up. Is first of all, that Schumer is majority leader, which is established because the president is a Democrat. So the role of House Majority Leader goes to whichever party is in the White House if it's a 50-50 split. And the Democrats get all the chairmanships of all the committees. Now, why does that matter? You might be like, well, what does that, who cares? That matters because the Senate Majority Leader is the one who determines the agenda. And if you have wondered about how Mitch McConnell kept so many bills from getting to the floor of the Senate, because he got to do the calendar. He got to do the schedule, and he would simply refuse to take bills up. And similarly, by having Democrats in the chairs of all the committees, which would normally happen if you have a majority, you have the chairmanships of everything. What that means is they're the ones who get to decide what are on the committee calendars. So they get to decide what gets taken up and what doesn't. So, for example, you may remember in the last Senate, Ron Johnson of Wisconsin kept having these, he was the chair of the Department of Homeland Security Committee. I got that name a little off. And he kept having these hearings about what's his name, Biden's laptop, and all kinds of conspiracy theories and all kinds of stuff. He could do that because he was the chair, and similarly, I hope not similarly, but the Democrats now can say, hey, let's have an investigation into, and they're going to go ahead and be able to come up with some of the stuff that we couldn't look at for the last 4 years, including things, for example, like the actual ties between America's extremist right wing and Russia. Remember, now we know that Parler is back up and it's coming to America through Russian servers. That's doesn't look real good, does it? All right, so now some more questions about this. A question here from Peter Foote. What are the chances that Trump loyalists will split away into a third party? And I guess I didn't talk a lot about the Republican Party. I actually think that the Republican Party is splitting and has split irrevocably. And it's a really interesting time for somebody like me because I have, I'm a scholar of the Republican Party, right? I've written like 5 books on the Republican Party. So I know them, I know the way they think, and I know historically as well as in the present, and I know what they have believed in, and I know where the stressors are. And I have never believed that the Republican Party would disappear. I still don't. And here's why. 2 reasons. First of all, because the ideology of the true Republican Party, as it was articulated by Abraham Lincoln first in 1859, and then as it's re-articulated in a slightly different form by Theodore Roosevelt at the turn of the last century, and then as it's re-articulated by Eisenhower in the 1950s, is enormously popular. It is a vision of the American political economy in which the government supports ordinary men on the make. They work hard, they make more than they can consume, and they help the people above them. They buy stuff from stores and all that. And they, in turn, keep in place a few financiers who, in turn, hire from the bottom. It's a vision of American society as a social web, a community that is not the same thing as the Democrats' vision, which is equally important, but is a different one. So as I kept saying to people, if you wipe the Republicans off the face of the earth tomorrow, they would reform, perhaps under a different name. But that ideology would come back because it is very much part of America's DNA at this point. That's going to take different shape in different eras, but I think that's going to stay around. But the other reason that I don't think the party itself is going to disappear is because of what I just talked about. The committee chairmanships, the money, the accounts, the email lists, all the things, all the the veins and sinews and tissue that hold together the organism that is now a political party and that has such very deep roots in people's history, very hard to replace. I mean, you certainly know people, I do anyway, who have been voting Republican really since the Civil War. I mean, they vote Republican because their dads voted Republican, because their dads voted Republican. And as I always said, it would be easier, those people are going to vote R, whether it's Jesus or Satan, because they're Republicans. It's part of their identity. So it's easier to change the party, what it believes in and what it does, than to change those affiliations. So I don't think that party's going away. But what I do think is that the events of January 6th really have been a revelatory moment for a lot of Republicans, that a lot of what people on the left have been saying for a long time, and a lot of what historians like me have been saying, is that this party is going in a very dangerous direction, and you'd better regain control of it, because it's going to end up trying to destroy democracy. And a lot of people are like, yeah, you guys are all leftists, whatever. And then you've got people storming the Capitol. And that, I think, was a wake-up call to a lot of people who now, as I say, put pressure on people like Mitch McConnell to stop backing that wing of the party. And so what I think is what's going to happen is that the Trump faction is going to go its own way. And the Republican establishment party is going to carve those people away the way that they did in the 1950s and the 1960s. That being said, the establishment Republicans are not going to moderate their policies while Mitch McConnell's in charge of them. They're simply not. They're going to continue to try and slash social welfare programs, put money into the military, slash taxes so that money continues to move upward, as it has so incredibly dramatically since 1981. And those policies they're going to continue to fight for. They're just going to try to divorce them from the evangelical Christians and the voters. They're still very much in favor of the evangelical big money donors, and from the white nationalists and the KKK and the Boogaloo Boys and all those people. Boogaloo Boys, by the way, are kind of not, they're not really affiliated politically, that they're a different story. So anyway, I think that the party will indeed split, unless we go full fascist. But I don't think that's going to happen any longer, for a number of reasons, not least because corporate America took a look at what happened on January 6th and said, we're not doing this, folks. Start again. Really interesting, actually, because Trumpism is, I know I harp on this, but Trumpism is technically not fascism. It's basically an oligarchy. Now, for you and me, those differences don't mean a lot. At least, if the brown shirts come marching through, they're, we're not going to be like, oh, wait, are you the oligarchic brown shirts or the fascist brown shirts? I mean, to us, it's not going to matter. But if you are a person of wealth who is very well connected and trying to run a corporation, you don't really want to be part of an oligarchic society. I mean, you might, I'm not speaking for these people, but intellectually, fascism might work for you because fascism joins the governmental system with the economic system sort of in an even-handed way. There's everybody gets a piece. Oligarchy is who do you know? And that's really dangerous because you can see how quickly Trump turns on people. That's not actually a good system for people with a lot of money. And you saw this in America dramatically during the New Deal. We got Securities and Exchange law and the Securities and Exchange Commission, not because people like you and me were like, we think we need to make sure Wall Street's fair, but because corporate America thought Wall Street needed to be fair, because if it depended on who you knew, you were in trouble because, it was all, there were no rules, and it became impossible to do business. So I just don't think, I think the fact that Trump tried to turn the Republican Party into Trumpism meant that he lost the corporate support that the Republicans still need. All right, that's probably way more than you wanted to know about this stuff. But let me go on to a couple more things here, because people have asked, and I think this is so important right now, about healing. I heard all your heads explode, just so you know. Here's what I believe. I believe in the rule of law for everybody equally. And you know we don't have it now for people of color, for poor people, that our system does not treat everybody equally. And it's not that I don't believe in mercy. I mean, I do believe in mercy, but I believe in forgiveness, but I believe in justice first. You know, you can't have healing until people have actually faced the consequences of committing crimes. And I believe that from everybody from the lowest member of society to the highest. So when people say nowadays, as they are on the right, you know, this is divisive to go after the people who stormed the Capitol, or this is divisive to impeach the president. No, that's absolutely the language of abuse that I talk about so much. The idea that, um, that the person who, the abuser beats somebody, the bully beats somebody up, and then says, oh, if you take me to the principal's office, you're just rubbing it in. You're being divisive. Look at you're carrying a grudge. No, no, you need to enforce those boundaries, or there's no such thing as reconciliation. There's simply a continuation of bullying. How do you know this? Look what the Republican Party did after Nixon. Did it sit there and say, oh, you're right, we learned our lesson, we're not going to do this anymore? No, we got the Iran-Contra affair, which was an appalling example of a Republican administration directly breaking a congressional law. And then, of course, you got George W. Bush and his weapons of mass destruction. Similarly, after the Confederacy, or after the Confederate Rebellion, the idea that there were no penalties for having tried to destroy the United States, what did that buy us? It bought us the murder of the people who had fought for the United States government, the African American soldiers and supporters in the South. And it bought us 150 years of people lionizing the very people who tried to destroy us. It is insane that we have statues anywhere on public property to the people who tried to destroy our country. What other country does that? It would not have happened if in the wake of the Civil War, people had paid a penalty for that. They'd had to answer for whatever their crimes might have been, and it would have become odious to have been a part of a rebellion against the United States. That's not, again, to say that I believe in lining people up against a wall and shooting them. I believe in the legal system. And so when we talk about healing, I feel very strongly about starting there, starting with consequences for your actions. And that just is true across the board. And I guess maybe this is one place where being a mother or being a teacher comes out. And you see this a lot in a classroom if there are teachers out there, you often have that student who doesn't do any work and screws around and sometimes is downright rude or whatever. And they come to you at the end of the class and they say, I need a B or whatever. And I always say to them when the class starts and throughout the semester, if you can make an argument that you would make in front of all your class about why, not that I'm going to ask you to make it in front of your class, but about why you deserve a break on the final or not turning in a paper or whatever, then bring it to me. If there's been an act of God, you've lost a family member, health issues, whatever, and your classmates would all go, yeah, that's a good reason for you not to have to do it, then by all means come to me. But remember that when you come to me and you say, you're being mean because you're giving me a failing grade just because I didn't do the paper, there's a whole classroom of people here who did do the paper. There's a whole classroom of people who stayed up night after night after night studying for the final. And what you're saying to me is you should jump the line, and that somehow you don't have to follow the rules and they do. And so it's not a question of me being nice to you. It's about a question of me holding the line to make sure they get a fair shot. So when we talk, for example, about people like the people who stormed the Capitol saying, I deserve a pass, it's like, wait a minute. There's hundreds of thousands, millions of people out there who are disappointed in the election who didn't storm the Capitol. And we should give you a pass? Like, to me, that's just, it's an insult to the people who do follow the rules to simply say, oh yeah, we're going to be give you a cookie for having done it, and say, oh, it didn't matter, because it did matter and everybody else followed the rules. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now. That's not to say you can't be merciful. Again, an act of God, sure, but I broke into the Capitol of the United States and stole a laptop, and somebody should let me off the hook for that? I don't think so, at least not for me. All right, so when you talk about healing, there's some things we're facing going forward. The first of which is how did we get here? And one of the things that I have really noticed in the last few weeks is how much attention people are paying to that fairness doctrine I keep talking about. The doctrine that the Federal Communications Commission let expire in 1987 during the Reagan administration, when purveyors of information who were trying to push this movement conservative line I keep talking about, the idea that that taxes are destroying people's liberty, and all the things that have come to embody the Republican Party now. They were furious because they couldn't get a hearing on on broadcast media, because their arguments were not fact-based. They were narrative-based. They were basically going to become the Fox News channel. And so the Reagan administration listened to that, and they let the Fairness Doctrine expire. And the Fairness Doctrine insisted that if you had a public license for broadcast media, you had to present both. You had to be fact-based, and you had to present both sides of a story. And what that did is it meant that you couldn't have the Fox News channel. You couldn't have talk radio. Well, at the same time that falls apart, we get the explosion of cable and of other ways of reaching people that are not regulated at all. A lot of people are talking again about the Fairness Doctrine because, let's face it, what we've got now is a large percentage of our population that does not have a firm grasp on reality. And that's not okay. You actually can't have a democracy where people are not informed. They will destroy the country, as we're seeing now. They will believe that a free and fair election was stolen because they're repeatedly told that. There's a problem with bringing the Fairness Doctrine back because that was based in the idea of a government license. And of course, you don't need a government license any longer. I don't have a government license to do this. But there must be some way to cut down on disinformation. I don't know what that looks like, but it seems to me that's a really good way when we talk about healing to go forward, is to make sure that we are operating in a fact-based world, which again, I've talked about elsewhere. But then there's another issue here that I really want to emphasize, and that is that there are two ways to look at where we are going forward. And that is that we are in a period when there is a dramatic change going on in the way we think about government, and there's a dramatic change in our leadership. And we have two models, one that worked and one that didn't work, for how to, actually more than that, but two I wanted to talk about today, about what happens and how you create change. And the first is Grover Cleveland. When Cleveland was elected in 1892, he was elected by a lot because he was coming in after Benjamin Harrison, who had been elected with a minority of the vote. He had gone ahead and created his own mouthpiece. He had his own media channel. He had newspaper. He had overseen the Wounded Knee Massacre, big deal. He had put through total pro-business legislation. His family was a bunch of losers. His son and his wife moved into the White House and complained about the conditions there and tried to add on like new parts to the White House because it wasn't big enough for the family. I mean, stories that may sound somewhat familiar. So when people elect Grover Cleveland in 1892, he gets control of the House and the Senate. But in the lame duck period, the Republicans do everything they can to tank his upcoming administration. So the big thing is they basically crash the economy by telling everybody that this is it. The Democrats are going to destroy the economy. If you have money in the stock market, take it out. If you have money, if you're European, take your money out. That happens. And most of you probably remember Grover Cleveland from your textbook as being the person who oversaw the crash of '93. It happened 10 days before he took office. But there he is, stuck madly trying to solve this crisis that's been handed to him by malefactors in the Republican Party. And he doesn't manage to do it because he doesn't control the national conversation. He just can't convince people to get behind him. So he ends up splitting his party because he's trying to calm Wall Street. And they're like, ha, 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 look at you. And his party splits, and the whole thing becomes a complete disaster. In the midterm elections of that year, the Republican Party is like, see what's happening? Come to us. They get reelected in the midterms, and suddenly they go back to the newspapers and say, hey, we're back in charge. Everything's going to be fine. Money comes back in. The great crash of '93, our first major national depression, turns around, and everybody blames Grover Cleveland, who's actually quite a good president. But nobody even knows that. Even historically, he's been trashed because he got completely lambasted by the previous administration. Here's another example. Theodore Roosevelt. inherits the presidency after the assassination of William McKinley by Chalgos. I can't remember his first name. And he comes in, and they put him. The Republican Party had put Roosevelt on the ticket to because he was a progressive, and McKinley was very much a big business backroom dealer kind of guy. And they want to shut up the progressives, so they throw him on the vice presidential ticket. And then McKinley, of course, is assassinated by Chalgos, which is this bizarre moment because McKinley had lived through the Civil War, including, I believe, Antietam, and he gets shot in the stomach with this little tiny gun. But anyway, so Teddy Roosevelt gets in office, and at first the industrialists and the big business guys in the party are like, "Oh my God, what are we going to do? What are we going to do?" And then they're like, "Oh, we can manage him." And everything he tries to do, they literally just ignore him. They're like, they don't even argue. They're just like, whatever. Like, you go play with your little toys, Teddy. And he gets furious. And he goes to the people. And he goes to the people and he says, look at what these people are doing. They are destroying your government. And he creates what he calls the bully pulpit. And what he means by that is not like I'm a bully on the pulpit. It's a great, he called, when something was good, he called it bully. So it's the bully pulpit. And he got people behind him. And he went ahead and he created the progressive movement that went ahead and involved the United States government in issues of environmental care and health and welfare. He's the first to call for universal health care, all the sorts of things that laid down markers for the 20th century. Now, his successors were more successful than he was because he was repeatedly stopped in the Senate. But he does a lot through executive orders, of course. But the difference here, to me, is not so much the presidents. And certainly Cleveland teed up Roosevelt. But that in both cases, the ultimate arbiters of what the government was going to do came down to the people. So people ask me, what are we going to do? How are we going to make this happen? And my answer to that is keep the pressure on. And not just by calling your senators and representatives every day and writing letters and all that, but by taking up oxygen, by talking about things, by saying, you know, I really think we need, and you fill in the blank. I'm not here to tell you how to think, but I am here to say to you when people say, oh my God, McConnell's going to stop everything. No, McConnell wants to be reelected. McConnell wants Republicans in office. And if that means the Republicans have to shift their stance the way he just did on impeachment, on conviction, then he will do that. But he's certainly not going to do it unless he hears from people, because it's the people who make the noise who get noticed. And the difference, again, is that in Teddy Roosevelt's time, the people spoke up. In Cleveland's, they did not. And there's some other differences as well. But when we talk about healing and moving forward and how we can take on this next 4 years, do not expect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to do all the work. They cannot do it by themselves. It is our government. If you want changes to this government, you speak up, you demand change, and that will snowball. And in terms of bringing along the die-hard Republicans, the die-hard Trumpers, here's my take on it. There's some people you're never going to reach. Trump's approval rating, by the way, is in the toilet. So there's not a lot of people out there who are fervent supporters any longer. They get a lot of media press. There aren't all that many of them, statistically speaking. And a lot of them are completely unreachable. But there are a lot of people, including, I suspect, a number of QAnon supporters whose tune will change when the economy gets better, when their lives get better, when we get the coronavirus vaccine, when you can be out and around again. And those people are reachable. And what will reach them is less confronting them and saying, you know, you have to stop thinking the way you're thinking, but saying, hey, come join us. Come join us in this new world that is an exciting place to be, because we are doing so many wonderful things over here. And you see this, by the way, of course, in my comments. You know, when we ban people who are making insulting or abusive comments, often they come back and say they want to be part of this discussion. People want to be part of a community. Let's make it a community that they want to join, and that will go a long way, I think, in not getting stuck looking backward. And you can see this with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. They keep pushing on moving forward and not keeping score about the past. I'm about keeping legal score of the past and moving forward. But I don't think We are doomed to be in this position of tearing each other apart unless we choose to be. We don't have to be here. We've been in a place like this before in the past, and we've gotten beyond it. All right, 5 o'clock. I got to go ring the bells for COVID victims, which is, I feel horrible about doing, but also that it's important. Happy last full day of the Donald Trump presidency. Thank you for being here, and I will see you. Well, I'll write tonight, I'll write tomorrow, and I'll see you on Thursday. Thanks a lot.